Welcome back to Pollock Academy. I got myself a new position, a new home base here at the high school level, and today I'm going to talk about the Wright brothers. Well, not just the Wright brothers. If you're in my class, you know how much I love to talk about average Joes and Janes. Average people making history is what I'm all about. And in this case, we're talking about this photograph, the one I'm sitting in front of right now. It was taken by an average Joe, John T. Daniels. Also in my research, I found another eyewitness who was super interesting, and without the work of these two, we wouldn't have much proof or much to commemorate about the Wright brothers. Let's get into it.
Okay, so at the center of this mini-sode is this photograph. The Library of Congress titles it First Flight, 120 feet in 12 seconds, 10:35 a.m., Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. As on the nose as that title is, we're just going to call it the First Flight photograph. The First Flight photograph was taken by 29-year-old lifeguard John T. Daniels of the Kitty Hawk Life-Saving Station. He was one of 5 eyewitnesses that December day. He was joined by W.S. Doe, A.D. Etheridge, W.C. Brinkley, and Johnny Moore. More on him later. Keep in mind, this picture was the first flight of the day. They would do 3 more, and the longest time in the air would be just under a minute. And to add to this first flight photo, this was the first time that John T. Daniels saw or used a camera. The Wright brothers, being avid photographers, brought their Corona 5 view camera to the Outer Banks and took detailed photographs of their camp and experiments for proof of their work. We have several great primary sources of John T. Daniels' assistance that day with the Wright brothers. We obviously have this image that shows Wilbur and Orville both in the same frame, but we also have some correspondence that John T. Daniels wrote detailing his role in the first flight by helping get the plane back on the track and even lugging it back to camp where a gust of wind blew him sideways and got him tangled in the wiring, leading Daniels to remark that he was the first airplane casualty. Now, it might seem that John Daniels was at the right place at the right time to assist the Wrights that day. But looking more into it, Daniels and the others weren't merely happening along the beach and saw them. These men and other Outer Banks locals had seen the Wright brothers visit to do their experiments years earlier, and it seems that Daniels kept in contact with the Wrights after their success in 1903. He said that the Wrights gifted their bicycle to his children, where the tires were outfitted to ride on the sand. And here's a letter dated a couple years later in 1905. In this letter, Daniels updates the Wrights on the status of their garage and cabin. He had to deliver some bad news that some of their stuff had been stolen. I almost forgot to go back to that other eyewitness, Johnny Moore. Johnny Moore was only 16 at the time of the first flight in 1903, but he had seen the brothers work on the Outer Banks in years past, probably as young as 13. He was described as an eccentric young man from Collington, just a few miles from the first flight location, spending his days hunting, fishing, and trapping, and famously not wearing shoes. You can see him portrayed in the Wright Brothers Memorial Sculpture Garden, where the sculpture recreates this first flight iconic photo, where you have John Daniels manning the camera, and you have Johnny Moore cheering in the background. Years later, Johnny would be highly sought after, much like the rest of the eyewitnesses. At one point, Johnny was the last living eyewitness, and people were constantly asking him and others to recount their first flight story. Johnny Moore even got to meet President Hoover in Washington. By the late 1920s, aviation had obviously grown in usage and in practicality. Plans for a Wright Brothers Memorial started in 1928, and there was an official dedication in 1932. But in 1928, this memorial was planned 25 years after the first flight, and the winds had shifted the sand dune from the original 1903 location. It was actually John T. Daniels and Johnny Moore who assisted with finding the original sand dune at Kill Devil Hill, as well as the precise location of the original flight line that is commemorated at the Wright Brothers Memorial, complete with the starting point and the flight increments. After Johnny Moore helped that day in 1928, his wife apparently was giving birth at their home in Collington. Johnny ran home and named his child Orville Lindbergh Moore. Quite the aviation center name. And judging by this grave marker, it checks out. Thank you for listening to this Pollock Academy mini-sode, Average Joe's contribution to the first flight.